Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's special late night session of Common Ground. We're taking the most fabulous show of lunchtime and bringing it to you here at nighttime. I'm Malva-Kajali, the events assistant here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure of welcoming curator and Rail editor-at-large Maura Reilly back to our Zoom stage. She's once again curated a phenomenal lineup featuring curators Wanda Nanibush, Paul Chaat Smith, Megan Tamati-Quennell, alongside artist Richard Bell, who all join us this evening from all over the world for a conversation on Indigenous curatorial practices. We're also so lucky to have the poet India Lena González here with us today, who will read a few poems to close us out in style. So looking forward to that. Before we get into it, this talk is supported by our friends at Arizona State University School of Art, and thank you for making this all possible. Before we begin, I ask you all to join me in acknowledging the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and the Shinnecock Indian Nation, the traditional owners of Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters on which we stand. We've been thinking a lot over the past few months of how to connect these two acknowledgements we make at the beginning of our daily events, the one I just made and the one that will follow. And I guess how to properly register for the historical archive, the moment we're living in. So as we acknowledge the dispossession of Indigenous lands through white settler expansion, we also recognize that the problems of the American landscape are all interconnected traumas stemming from the wounds of white supremacy and historical dispossession, which is all still around us. And so on that note, the Brooklyn Rail would like to honor the memory and the legacy of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, David McAtee, James Scurlock, Jamel Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Rayshard Brooks, Dominique Remy Fells, Toyin Salau, Walter Wallace Jr., Casey Goodson, and countless others we have lost to white supremacy and police violence in this country. We acknowledge that justice will come from the streets, from the nation demanding accountability and refusing to move on until Black Lives Matter in the eyes of the state. Before I hand the microphone over to our phenomenal moderator, I'd like to invite you to join us for a brief moment of silence. Thank you. And now handing it over to the woman who needs no introduction, Maura Reilly. Maura, the microphone is yours.
Thank you, Mavika. I'm so excited to see this huge crowd with us here today. I want to thank you all for joining us. We are having this on a sort of different time zone to accommodate for people who are joining us from around the world. So I want to also take the opportunity to begin my introduction today by acknowledging the Acamel, Udam, and Hohokam peoples who are the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work in Arizona and where sovereignty was never ceded. So I want to pay my respects to their elders and to state that I stand in solidarity with their ongoing resistance against colonization. I want to thank Fong Bui, Artistic Director at the Rail, for this opportunity to bring this panel to you today, and Nick Bennett and Malva-Kajali for their incredible assistance. This is the third installment of a series of panels I'm organizing on the subject of curatorial activism, and the others are available on YouTube, as this one will be as well. Now, for those of you that don't know me, curatorial activism is a term that I coined about a decade ago and extrapolated upon in great detail in my 2018 book, Curatorial Activism Towards an Ethics of Curating. And the book itself celebrates contemporary curatorial strategies that provide productive and at times transformative alternatives to mainstream curatorial strategies that we see everywhere that continue to reproduce inequality in their almost exclusive focus on white, Western, cis male artists. So curatorial activists, is my definition here on the screen, then, are curators who organize exhibitions with the principal aim of ensuring that large constituencies of artists are no longer excluded from the master narratives of art. They are curators, like the speakers who are with us today, who commit themselves to counter-hegemonic initiatives that give voice to those who have been historically silenced or omitted altogether from the canons of art history. And as such, curatorial activists speak and focus almost exclusively on work produced by BIPOC artists, non-Euro-American artists, women artists, and or queer artists. Now, one chapter in my book is titled Tackling White Privilege and Western Centrism, which argues for the very urgent need for anti-racist curatorial practices. And it celebrates projects like you probably know, Fred Wilson's Mine in the Museum, Century City, Documenta 11 with Okweonwizor, 2015 Venice Biennale, et cetera, et cetera. But to that chapter, I could have equally added exhibitions embodying decolonial strategies, like those my colleagues will be discussing today, as well as shows like Sakahan at the National Gallery of Canada, or Nirin, the last biennial of Sydney, among many others. Now, today's international panel of speakers focuses on anti-racist curating, but with a specific focus on decoloniality. I'm going to introduce our speakers using their short bios, but I encourage you to do some Google research so you can see the kind of incredible, extensive work that they've been involved with, but allow me to kind of give you a truncated version of what they've all done. Now, Paul Chaat Smith joins us from Washington, DC. Paul is a Comanche author, essayist, and curator. His books and exhibitions focus on the contemporary landscape of American Indian politics and culture. Paul joined the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian in 2001, where he now serves as curator. Some of his many exhibitions include Americans Stretching the Canvas, James Luna's Emendatio at the 2005 Venice Biennale, Fritz Shoulder, Indian, Not Indian, and Brian Jungen's Strange Comfort. Paul's also an author. He's the co-author of a book called Like a Hurricane, The Indian Movement from Alcatraz to Wounded Knee, and another book, Everything You Want to Know About Indians Is Wrong. Now, Paul would like us to know, and I love this part in his bio, is that although he spends most of his time crafting game-changing exhibitions and texts, he also enjoys reading obsessively about the early days of the Soviet space program and watching massive amounts of televised sports and writing about himself in the third person. So thank you, Paul, for joining us. Our second speaker is Megan Tamati-Quennell. She joins us from Wellington, New Zealand, where it is now Friday morning. She's having coffee with us. Megan is a leading specialist in the field of modern and contemporary Maori and Indigenous art. She currently holds two curatorial positions. One is curator of modern and contemporary Maori and Indigenous art at Te Papa in Wellington, and the other as Indigenous curator of contemporary art at the Sandra Brewster Art Gallery in New Plymouth. Her research interests are broad. They include contemporary Maori art movement, Maori modernism, Maori women artists of the 1930s until today, the Maori Internationals, which I had not heard of, but it's a group of contemporary Maori artists who rose to prominence during the 1990s. Other interests include the bicultural era of New Zealand and Indigenous art curatorial praxis. Megan is working on many projects currently. I'll just highlight a few. A solo exhibition of Dale Harding's work, an artist who I adore. Another titled Land, Site, Place that features the work of Shona Rapira Davies, Kate Newby, Matt Pine, Anna E.T., and that was for the Sandra Brewster. She's also currently working on a limited edition publication that focuses on the major commission by Michael Parakawa, and also working on an exhibition and publication, which I'm very much interested in seeing, focused on the women of Maori modernism, among other projects. Our third speaker is Wanda Nanabush, who joins us from Toronto, Canada. Wanda is an Anishinaabe image and word warrior, curator, and community organizer for the Beausoleil First Nation. She is currently the inaugural curator of Indigenous art and co-leads the Indigenous and Canadian Art Department at the Art Gallery of Ontario. Her current AGO exhibition, Rebecca Belmore Facing the Monumental, is touring internationally. Wanda holds a Master's of Visual Arts degree from the University of Toronto, where she's also taught courses. And in addition to many catalog essays, Wanda has published widely on Indigenous art, politics, history, feminism, and sexuality. Our fourth and final speaker today is my friend, the artist Richard Bell, who joins us from Brisbane, also with coffee to match our wine. He is one of Australia's most significant artists. his interdisciplinary practice is committed to the politics of Aboriginal emancipation and self-determination. Richard has exhibited widely and internationally, including a major retrospective exhibition that I curated, which traveled to 4 US venues from 2011 to 13. Some more recent projects include a collaborative exhibition of new work with Emory Douglas, the cultural minister of the Black Panther Party, as well as an exhibition called Bell Invites that showcases work by friends and collaborators at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. More recently, Bell premiered a body of new work for the Asia Pacific Triennale, which is at Goma in Brisbane, and premiered a new sculptural commission in 2016 at the Dutch Art Institute in Arnhem. In 2017, he's been very prolific, clearly. Bell exhibited in the National New Australian Art, which is a comprehensive survey in contemporary Australian art that took place at several venues. And in 2021, forthcoming, I think it's in June, July, opening up, he has a major retrospective at the MCA in Sydney. And importantly, he'll be talking about this today, in 2022, Richard will be presenting his Aboriginal tent embassy in the Turbine Hall at the Tate Modern. I'm seated before one image of his Aboriginal tent embassy. I've invited Richard today as an artist to discuss his iconic embassy project, which is a carefully curated pop-up mobile exhibition that he's presented in cities around the world since 2013, including at the last Venice Biennale and as part of Performa 15 in New York City, among a dozen other venues. So as you can see, we have an extraordinary panel today. I've asked the speakers to present to us for 10 to 12 minutes an overview of their practice, which I'm sure will be impossible, and will be followed by a roundtable and a Q&A. And before starting, I just want to show you the next slide, that the next panel we are hosting is on queer curating. And that's the 4th in the series of curatorial activism, and we hope we'll see you there also. So I will turn to Paul Chaat Smith to start us off. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Professor Reilly. It's good to be with you all, Brooklyn, around the world. So here we are, alone together again. In my life, I can't remember a time when there was this sense of unending crisis, month after month, crises of all kinds. And it feels off to not acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from my home in Washington, 1.8 miles from the US Capitol. The shocking insurrection on January 6th has everyone here still on edge. The experts promised months ago we would see a dark winter, and that's one prediction that certainly came true. Okay, first, decolonization. I align myself with Native archaeologist Dorothy Lippert, who says large national museums cannot decolonize. And I might agree with her, still not sure, that while the end result is a pipe dream, museums like mine can engage in a process of decolonizing. 3 years ago, and 3 years and 2 weeks ago, at the National Museum of the American Indian, we opened a show called Americans, which I curated with Cecile Argentome. It was a big, expensive, risky exhibition. The central argument was that imagery of Indians and Indian names are the wallpaper of American life, a weird, collective, unconscious acknowledgement that American Indians are central to American history, national identity, and contemporary life. We framed it as a subversive phenomena hiding in plain sight, because most Americans never see Indians and rarely think about us. So how could all this wallpaper mean anything when it's practically screaming, pay us no mind, this is kitsch, keep moving? And we said, though it's normalized, actually it shows that the American people are on some level thinking about us all the time. And we propose that the imagery can be seen as a source of great power, as it unlocks a buried history of the centrality as popular culture over 3 centuries of American life actually show an obsession with Native people. So we argue this wallpaper of American life is also just a tip of the iceberg, and underneath were titanic moments in US history that reshaped the country. We looked at 3 of those: Pocahontas, the Battle of Little Bighorn, and the Trail of Tears, which is the one I'm going to talk to this evening. The entrance is heralded with the words, "Trail of Tears, not what you think, not even close." The exhibition sees removal in the 1830s of Native people from the American South as a center of a profound and massive reshaping of nations and economies. With the final barrier of intact indigenous nations removed, the Cotton Kingdom and the enslaved laborers needed to run it exploded. We also point out the Removal Act was narrowly passed after an authentic debate in Congress in which Native leaders and civic organizations had agency and voice. We respectfully dissent from the popular idea it was all about mean Mr. Jackson. Removal was a cruel and disastrous policy taken with eyes wide open after a fair and vigorous national debate. While we argue that, of course, the United States was not a true democracy in 1830, it was nonetheless the truest and most advanced democracy at the time. The removal policy did much of what it promised, not the part about pretending that removal would be voluntary up to Native Americans, quite the opposite. Removal was devastating to Native people. But the part about bringing wealth and power to the South came true. Soon, the richest Americans in the country had zip codes in Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana. New England got rich too, as did Great Britain. It reshaped economies and borders, and as historians are beginning to argue, really should be considered the most significant event between the American Revolution and the Civil War. And all of the Cotton Kingdom and all the wealth it produced led to the enslavement of 4 million human beings and the bloodiest war in American history. So when we began researching this, the curatorial team, and started pitching this approach to Trail of Tears, people loved it at the museum. Bigger and badder and way more consequential. Put American Indians at the center of an event that had national and global implications. But there was a problem. If our larger view of Trail of Tears says removal was a reason for the explosion of the Cotton Kingdom and enslavement, and let's remember just a few decades earlier, abolitionists thought they were on the verge of defeating slavery in the United States. It meant that we couldn't ignore the fact that these famous 5 civilized tribes that were removed were slave states themselves. And this is when, curatorially speaking, history isn't your friend, not even a frenemy. History becomes a mangy, snarling dog standing between you and your cozy home with a burning fireplace, dinner on the stove, and a crowd-pleasing narrative. Obviously, the story should be and needs to be that the enslaved Black people and the soon-to-be exiled Red people would join forces and defeat their common oppressor. That's what the story should be. That's what I need the story to be. And that's what my public needed the story to be. But the mangy, snarling dog won't stand down. If I had a shotgun, maybe I'd think about it, but I'm no dog killer. So the mangy, snarling dog of history here is the irrefutable historical record that shows these 5 indigenous nation states were deeply committed to slavery, and after being removed to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, immediately established their own racialized Black codes, reestablished slavery in the territory, rebuilt their nations in part with slave labor, crushed slave rebellions, and enthusiastically sided with the Confederacy in the Civil War. They saw themselves as superior to Blacks and equal to whites. The 5 civilized tribes, these nations, they had newspapers, legislatures, governments. They issued formal lengthy statements on their positions on what they called African servitude and why they decided to join and fight with Confederacy. There's never been any mystery here. It's in the primary documents from the time. But do you want to hear all that? I don't think so. Nobody does. When I was coming up, here's what I learned about all this. First, that it's a big lie. Second, we later admitted, yeah, there was some of that going on, but actually those weren't Cherokees or Chickasaws. They were white people who said they were Cherokee or Chickasaw. And I remembered hearing another iteration that said, okay, sometimes what happened is we pretend that we own slaves just to protect our brothers and sisters from the slave catchers. In later decades, it was admitted that, okay, some of these civilized tribes did own slaves, but it wasn't really the same as when white people owned slaves. It was a kinder, gentler type of enslavement. And it was pointed out, it wasn't that many Indians by any measure who did this bad thing. Note, this is true. Most white Mississippians did not own slaves either. Slaves were really, really expensive. So these were the arguments that we were all still saying into the current century. My favorite version, which my museum and many others have relayed, is what I call the Samsonite Narrative. And this story focuses on the Trail of Tears as a place to admit there was some slavery going on. And in careful, studied, neutral, and boring sentences, think the iTunes end user agreement, describes how some of the tearful exiled Indians owned slaves and brought them along with other possessions on the death march to Indian territory. It was all meant to be touching and interesting, but it was also saying, pay no attention to this. So when we built the Americans exhibition, we made a choice. We decided to go there. We felt the story of the Cotton Kingdom and this moment being central to the period between the Revolution and the Civil War was so important. We had to tell it honestly, put Indians at the center, but we also have to be unambiguous that Indian nations were both victims of racist violence and they were also oppressors. Now, in case anybody thinks I have something against the Cherokee, they can consult texts I've written about the Comanche that are much harsher than anything I'm saying here. How does all this fit into decolonizing? I'm not sure. What I do feel is that it's dangerous to be complicit in romantic notions about American Indians. It's caused so much destruction, so many bad policies. And ultimately, I insist that Indian people are fully human. I used to have a much more complicated theory of what I believe in Gramsci and different things, but it's sort of come down to that. Indians are fully human. It sounds so corny. Who doesn't think Indians are fully human in 2021? But I would say the answer is all of those who imagine Indians are always victims, never oppressors, always noble, never stupid, always generous, never greedy. Being fully human means being capable of all of the spectacular grace and kindness, brutality and evil that have defined humans all over the planet for 100,000 years. And finally, lest I leave you with a picture of me being the hero of this curatorial story, not so fast. One panel shows a picture of Greenwood LaFleur's house in Mississippi. He owned 400 human beings and was a Choctaw principal chief, a political leader, and a spiritual leader. He modeled the house on one that was built by Napoleon in France. So I often think these days about a precocious 10-year-old Choctaw girl visiting DC for the first time. The pandemic is over. Unlike all Indians who comes to NMAI for the first time, she immediately wants to know, where's the exhibit on her tribe? Usually we say, well, there's thousands of tribes and only so many thousands of square feet, so we don't have an exhibit on your tribe, but there'll inevitably be something referencing the tribe this person is asking about. So I picture my 10-year-old Choctaw girl is smart, really smart, but I can't imagine her being too happy with confronting that panel and not seeing other aspects of the Choctaw people presented at the National Museum of the American Indian. But these are the hard choices, what makes us a curator, and to believe there's no cost, even when you're confident of your messages and intent, is fanciful. Nothing is free, nothing is easy. Thanks for listening.
Paul, thank you. Thank you so much. You're seeing hands clapping across here. Paul, thank you. I'm really interested and hope we can pick up on the Dorothy Lippert point that you made, which I think is so interesting, about how museums cannot decolonize, but they can engage in the process of decolonizing. So I hope we can get to that point. Thank you so much for sharing all about the Americans exhibition. So we will turn now to Megan Tamati-Quennell, again, who's joining us from Wellington. Thanks, Megan.
Ko rangi nui ki runga, ko papatuna ku ki raro, ko tangata kei wanganui, te hei Māori ora. Kei te mihi a hau I te mātua nui e te rangi, nana nei ngā mea katoa. I ngā karangaranga maha, I te whānau whānui, I te iwi whānui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko te atiawa rau ko ngaitahu oku iwi, ko rani ere ere hana rau ko hana ani wala, oku tupuna, no te wahi painamu, toku ukai pō ko Megan Tamati-Quennell taku ingoa. The brief mihi I've given is to kind of introduce myself, to acknowledge my place in the world, and to thank Maura Reilly firstly for inviting me to participate in this discussion, Curatorial Activism, Decolonial Curating. I also want to thank Malvika Jolie for her work and support, and mihi to my co-panelists and friends, Wanda Nanabush, Richard Bell and Paul Chaat Smith, for also participating in this. So as I said, my name is Megan Tamati-Quennell. I'm a curator of 30 years, 31 I think this year. I'm probably the most established and long-serving curator of contemporary Māori art in the country, and was the third contemporary Māori art curator, following on from Rangi Pānoho, Dr. Rangi Pānoho and George Hubbard, who were the first contemporary Māori art curators by definition, and working prior to me in the 1980s. It's interesting to say that because a number of early Māori artists, Selwyn Muru and Buckman, for example, curated important Māori exhibitions in the late 1960s before there were established positions at all. I started my curatorial career in 1990, which was the sesquicentennial, or the 150 years since the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, at the National Art Gallery in Wellington, and I suppose I found my calling being there. I'm not sure you choose to be a curator. I think it kind of is something that kind of chooses you. I kind of sort of fell into curating. It wasn't necessarily by design. I was a journalist before I was a curator, as I always believed I could kind of write. I had a strong interest in film, worked in the film industry, Māori film industry, with filmmakers like Barry Barkley, Tama Puata and Larry Parr. I always wanted to be a filmmaker, and then didn't like the hierarchy within the industry, particularly in the way in which it operated towards women. And I'm a weaver, a traditional weaver. So I wove for a number of years at the Wellington Arts Centre under a woman called Diane Prince, and at Waiwhitu Marae with Eranora Pukitapu Hitit. I have specialised throughout my curatorial career in modern and contemporary Māori and Indigenous art. I'm not sure though that I'm a decolonial curator. I say that because I don't really use that term, the term decolonial. I read it as attempting to kind of undo something that's been done, and not something not something done by me. I'm not sure that is my role to undo the colonial project. That perhaps for me is a role for non-Māori curators. Even the term you talked about, Moda, earlier, which was re-Māorification, I'm not sure it works completely for me either. It also wasn't Puawai Ken's that termed that, her term. It was a term that Moana Jackson, a Māori lawyer and Treaty of Waitangi expert and activist who's amazing, coined, and that Puawai really embraced herself. I'm a curator, though, who curates from a Māori and decentered art historical perspective, who curates projects, I suppose, that do challenge the primarily male and Western orientation of art history. But I think further than that, I really work as a curator from an autonomous Māori space with no apology. And through my curatorial work, which is made up of research, writing, collection development and exhibition making, I still believe collections and exhibitions are the building blocks to art history. I offer an alternate art history, one that I'm actively building, and that provides a view into an alternate art reality and into a Māori ontology, I suppose, or Māori way of being. I also think, and I kind of say this, that I'm an artist curator, a curator who works for and to artists. And I think that's a really important distinction. There are curators who aren't necessarily that way. The images I'm clicking through are selected images from shows I've curated. They begin with Arnold Manaki Wilson's. Can we just go back to that one further? Yeah, that one. Wilson's work in the beginning sections of Tūranga Waiwai art in New Zealand. He was a Ngai Tūhoi man and one of the first Māori artists to graduate in fine arts from Auckland University's Elam School of Fine Arts in sculpture in 1952. He was told once that if he wanted to make Māori art, he needed to go home and wear a grass skirt. So it's really interesting what was going on. It's an image of his work, which is a po whenua, and that I kind of centered in that space. And they kind of operated as sentinels that asserted a Māori and Indigenous presence, which you had to negotiate before you got to the colonial portrait wall. The next images are of the late and great, James Luna, in an 8-hour performance that called Urban Almost Rituals, which he curated after visiting 2 of my home communities, Pariaka and Otako, and that I commissioned with the contemporary art curator at Te Papa for a project called One Day Sculpture. It was a project that I had wanted to work with James for like 10 years. It took me 10 years to get him to get over this side and to be able to work with him. The next images are images of Lisa Reihana's a project for the contemporary marae. It's like the female entrance, which was called Mai iti aroha, ko iti aroha, From Love Comes Love. The following images on that, sorry, I'm sort of speeding through them because I realise we don't have much time. I'll just wait. Michael Parikulwhai's Venice Biennale exhibition. If you can get to the next one, sorry. 2 more. I had a lot of slides. On first looking in Chapman's Homer, reimagined at Te Papa, kind of in the way that he conceived the show firstly. So it has all the elements together in one room. It was the only thing I could kind of offer him to reimagine it there. It was always shown alternately, separately. And then the next images are of a project called Black Rainbow that put Ralph Hortery and Michael Parikulwhai's work together and worked with ideas of the classic, Ralph's work and the Baroque Michael's and many other things. The following images are 2 artists, Shonara Peter Davies and Emily Karaka, a show that compared and contrasted 2 senior Māori women artists, a practice who were at the forefront of the Manawahine Māori art movement that came off the back of feminist art in the 1970s, but was also about Māori women particularly and was aligned with the Māori protest movement. Their art giving voice to the landlessness, imbalance and inequity Māori were experiencing. Te Ao Hau is a project that I worked on. It's called Te Ao Hau Modern Māori Art, which was a research strategy and acquisition strategy in a series of exhibitions that looked at different aspects of Māori modernism and alternate modernism and an art history that was not really understood or even really known about. Peter Robinson is the next images after that, retorts and comebacks, and it was a small survey show of his work and practice. And I have to say I buy all these works for the collection as well. So I'm actively trying to build a whole history and kind of look episodically at what was happening and who was doing what. The following images from there is a show called Māori Minimalism and International Influence, which included works by Ad Reinhardt, Ralph Hortery and Matt Pinney. And then then following that, a show called Filmic Imaginaries, Tracy Moffat and Jacqueline Fraser. I'll just wait, sorry. And the final couple of images are Michael's Artist as Curator project, which kind of mined the museum a la Fred Wilson, but Michael said, but cooler, as Michael said, and critiqued the position of contemporary art at Te Papa, created for the opening of the new Toy Art Gallery. His argument was, you know, how does things not become, he talked about the art gallery being a box inside a box inside a box, and how do you not historicize things as soon as they come in the door if it's a museum rather than a contemporary gallery. And then the final images are of a show called Tamatea Legacies of Encounter, where the show kind of pivoted off William Hodges' painting, who was a colonial painter, one of the first European painters in New Zealand who came on the second voyage with Cook. And I made sure that I could kind of position both the iwi stories or the Māori stories of Dusky Sound, the place where he went, Tamatea, with the stories, the other European stories, and ensure that there was a contemporary kind of art perspective and reading of his work and practice, including inviting a collective who create called Kaiho Kai Collective. So we had like a huge feast because Tamatea was a location that Naita, who never lived in, but was a major like food gathering area. So we had a huge kind of feast in the gallery. I suppose I want to finish by just making a few comments. I suppose I'm a curator who I work actively to open space for modern and contemporary Māori and Indigenous art, and want to move us from the margins to the centre, our centre, as Rangipa Noho once wrote. And I'm interested in unsettling the line between customary and contemporary. As another colleague posited, and I'm a curator who wants to resist ideological closure or fixed position to ensure our art is not limited or fixed and is always presented as open, evolving, and continually being reimagined. Thank you very much.
Megan, thank you. I see some claps around here. Thank you so much. The title Decolonial Curating is meant to be deliberately provocative, so I appreciate your recognition of that, and it's a point we'll return to in the Q&A. Thank you for giving us such a quick but beautiful sort of overview of what you've been doing and also your curatorial philosophy. So thank you for sharing that. Looking forward to circling back on some things when we get to the Q&A or roundtable. But I want to turn now to Wanda Nanabush, who will be sharing with us a 10 to 12 minute overview of the million things that she's done. So thanks, Wanda.
Yeah, no problem. You can put my slides up. I want to see how much Megan has done and Paul has done and everyone has done that's even listening today. And I'm in deep and profound awe because we don't stand here without the work that everyone has done before us and everyone is currently doing. And also, none of us would be here without the work of artists. So primarily, miigwech to the artists and to you, Richard, who's been really at the forefront of so much for all of us globally. I was just on a long call with Rhoda Roberts, and she said this thing. She's like, we survive institutions through kinship. And I think that's super true, and definitely how I've operated in my life. And I consider all of you kin and many of you who are on this call as well. Can we still call it a call? We can do that. I wanted to be a little more specific to use an example, but I probably will move between example and generalities and just throw a bunch of things at you in 10 minutes. I'm not going to talk about my curatorial practice because it goes well beyond the Art Gallery of Ontario where I currently work, but all of my practice is situational and deeply embedded in the spaces that I work. So the strategies are different in different spaces, and I think that's the kind of fluidity that I want to maintain. I would say I'm with Megan. I don't put myself under the decolonial banner. made that public. And but it's still a very useful terminology. It's really useful in lots of different ways. But personally, I work from the positionality of asserting sovereignty. And I agree with Jolene Rickard, who talks about sovereignty as an action. And I push that into thinking about it as also a kind of performativity, a kind of process, an ongoing process that we have to continually engage, continually expand, because we have to be constantly knowledge and experiencing, knowledge-seeking individuals, because we can't pretend that colonization and racialization and violence haven't happened. They've influenced, and Christianization especially, have influenced our people, our communities, our stories. And we also need to go through that process of taking all of that out. And that is a decolonial process that I think many of us are also involved in. But it means that sovereignty is a process and not a place. I also, this is some of the strategies that we took up at the Art Gallery of Ontario, which is, well, you could say the largest museum now, because technically square footage wise it is. So the AGO is on Mississauga Anishinaabe territory, Haudenosaunee territory, Wendat territory. And we kind of label that right away when you walk into the space. So as a way to ground these questions of sovereignty in terms of where people find themselves when they walk into the gallery. The texts, actually, more important for me is the language. So the fact that everything is translated into Anishinaabe-kwe, which is the longest language of where the building is on. And it's one way, I think, that we expand our languages, because our elders, keep going forward, our elders have to come up with new words often, and they have to figure out how our way of talking about art does or doesn't fit our culture. And so I'm always looking for those fault lines of where we can't translate. So the fact that we can't translate the unconscious, things like this show us a bit more about how we might think art from within Anishinaabe understanding of the world. One of the other ways to think through sovereignty is that we come into our work as full human beings. We can't parse things out. We have to come fully ourselves. And that means all the mess, all the trauma, but all the good stuff too, all the cultural knowledge, all of our training in schools, because most of us have gone to school now. So the whole mess of that, holding that always at the forefront, so that we can state where we want to go, not ask. So instead of saying like, thank you for the opportunities, we actually need to push forward and have Indigenous-led ideas, projects that center Indigenous philosophies and ways of being inside the museum. So we sort of looked at the wampum treaties, and not just the two-row wampum, but this is the one that is comes from the Haudenosaunee, and it is the most widely known, I think, within Canada. And so that's why I always kind of turn to it. And it also is a foundational treaty, and sort of gives us a sense of what values. So immediately it's an aesthetic object, but it can never just be an aesthetic object, which always reminds us that Indigenous art can never be just aesthetic. So it's also a governance document. It's also a series of value system. It's also a series of relationships. And so these are the ways I start to try, it forces me to think differently inside the museum. So we want to look at the value systems of mutual respect, reciprocity, honesty, integrity, things that you would think just naturally come to human beings, but don't in the white world. And these are some of the ways we can unwind ourselves from the white words we have become, which happen all the time. Next slide. So really we have to think very hard about what we want, need, and desire. And because I'm working in a major institution that is a very white colonial institution, actually began as a colonial house and then has expanded into a kind of more major museum that's encyclopedic. the first thing I noticed was space. So you see these deep blue squares? That was the only spots with Indigenous art on the second floor, and it's a 5-floor gallery. So immediately that tells you what they value. Immediately it tells you where you stand. Immediately it tells you if you belong and if you want to be there. So I took a tack from my fellow folks that hit the streets all the time and our communities, and did a land claim in the building. Next slide. So that we could start expanding our space. So you see the dark blue are all Indigenous fully spaces. I always take a 2-pronged approach, because we always talk about, not wanting to be ghettoized, and then we also talk about not wanting to always be read through Western art history when we are so-called integrated. So we take a 2-pronged approach. We do both. We always have Indigenous only spaces where Indigenous folks can have their own conversations, have their own histories, start those deep talks that we need to get into. And then there are the kind of more lighter blue spaces, which are spaces that have Canadian art and Indigenous art in them. The conversation is still set by Indigenous art, though, to correct for the historical imbalance and the historical exclusion. And this is only 1 floor. These blues would be on each floor now, actually, because it's still doing land claims in other departments like European. So next slide. So we decided to move away from sort of a historical narrative, and we started to move away from using Canadian art as a starting point. So, but we still wanted to think about the land that we're on. And so since Toronto is a city of migration, it was interesting to see the relationship between, a huge amount of refugees who come here, not because they want to, but because they have to. Immigration, Canada wouldn't exist without immigration. And then think about our origin story as Anishinaabe people begins with a migration from a flood story. So it's the way to dislodge the notion of indigeneity as something fixed and in one place also. We are people who moved around, and it's really important to acknowledge that and to understand what that means, such that we as cultural workers can keep on moving around like many have done before. Keep going. Keep going. This is where the origin story would have started before, with this lovely white lady who gave the building to the AGO. I mean, there's a lot of lovely white ladies that actually are really heavily involved in the arts. Next slide. And then Kent Monkman takes her and, dresses as her and puts her in a totally other queer scene. Next slide. So this is the first kind of space that you walk into, which is called the Zelf Self, because performing the self was too intellectual for our audiences, apparently. But the idea is that we need to unwind ourselves from the kind of very Victorianism that still exists in our current culture and that Indigenous folks are constantly pushing against, and that makes no sense in terms of artwork and the work that our artists are making today. Keep going. So this is the second install after the first one you just saw, and this is Sandra Brewster. And the reason I put this in here is because as we start working through collections and thinking about what's missing and start filling those gaps, we have to make sure that we don't make art and artists stand in for representation, because that isn't what they're doing. That's not what they're creating. That's not why they do the work they do. And so it was really important to me to choose a work that, one, is massive and takes up space, so you have that kind of land claim feeling, but also within it, embedded within it, is a critique of a kind of visuality, of a kind of locating of Blackness within a visual space. And so the person is moving, they're blurring. And then at the same time, it is a gel wall transfer directly on the wall. So it will be in this institution forever. Even when we paint over it, it's still going to be there, like haunting it in some kind of way. So I think a lot about that and the work that we do to kind of unbury things, or or bring things to the surface, and then also let things kind of go back underneath that maybe have had too much visibility. And she's working from thinking about Glissant's, Edward Glissant, the Martinique author's notion of opacity, which is another kind of aspect that I work from, which is thinking about the ways in which we can communicate, but not have to reduce everyone to what we can understand about them. So to have a real respect for the spaces and places inside human beings and other cultures that we just don't understand, and we actually don't need to be able to move forward, and we shouldn't even try, because as soon as we do, that's a colonizing gesture. Keep going. This is Robert Hoole. So we have a land room, land, water. There's some of the very basic themes. Next slide. So he's placed alongside Lauren Harris, who is like the epitome of Canadian painting. And instead of doing this kind of critique, saying landscape paintings, you know, are all about terra nullius and like Indigenous people don't exist, we decided to instead put the actual territory and who, with the treaties that govern those territories, if it's unceded, if there is a land claim process going on, all of that sort of into the label instead, as a way of making a creation, as a way of creating something as opposed to critiquing it. And I do believe other curators are welcome to critique all they want. It just doesn't interest me so much. Just to some more views. So I think one of the things that also interests me is that as an Anishinaabe person, we believe that human beings are put on this earth with gifts that you are meant to kind of spend your life doing, and that each individual is sovereign. And so I like to treat audiences this way as well. And so we don't tell them where to go. We don't tell them what to think. They have their own pathways through there. So if you wanted to go through and learn all you could about, you know, feminism and art, like you could do your own path. If you wanted to learn about social issues very specifically, like this one, which deals with the 94 Indigenous communities that don't have access to clean drinking water, next slide, you can. So there's all these different, if you want to learn about abstraction from an Indigenous and Western point of view, you can kind of wander through and do that. Another shift we've made is the language around some of the historical works that we do not have names for. So this is Haida artist once known. So to say that they belong to a community, their name was known, the fact that it's not known today kind of makes you ask the question why. And also to remind ourselves that people in our communities know who these people are. So we need to do research differently as well. Keep going. And then the transformation room, the centerpiece is this Rita Laton work, Daybreak, 1983, which she created for a hospital, a hospice area. And I've made a real commitment to Rita Laton at the AGO because she's lived in Toronto for a really long time and had been totally kind of, hadn't had a major show in like 30, 40 years. And she is one of the first, 1947, you know, started in 1947, one of the very first Indigenous women to kind of make it in a very, very masculine abstract painting world. Did get renown, had to face a lot of racism and sexism in her career. Wanted to give her this moment so that she could see her own work because she was going blind at the time we did a solo show for her. And these are two dancers that Tanya Lucan Linklater, we invited her to do a public program in the exhibition, and they wanted to pay tribute to her work. And so you can see they're kind of mimicking her, her painting styles. And this is something that I think is really important. You can skip this one, is to keep bringing liveness into the building. Like I'm primarily started as a curator of film, video, new media, and performance art. So it's funny that I'm now in an institution that really was created for painting. Next slide. So one of the things in the Indigenous to Indigenous room that I wanted to look at, just to start people, is to look at time-based media and new media. because it's really, it kind of does go against the grain of what our audiences desire, which is the more so at the back, right? Like that's the big painting at the back there, that is what people want. And I want to push them a little further into understanding that our artists have been involved in multiple things. And then why do we choose time-based media? And why do we choose these kinds of ways of making work that are non-linear? And then the shirt. So being able to tell really hard truths in direct ways. So I think you can just scroll through the rest. I, like Megan, I'm an artist-centered curator, which means that I do believe that artists come with a vision that needs to be respected, much like our visionaries do in the community. And the ways that we can respect their work while also bringing it into conversation. And curators do have a role to play in telling different stories with the work that shows the artist something new about their work as well. And so you can't like be too kid gloved, but it's kind of a balance between the artists. It's a dance that we do together. And these are just some of the ways in which I've been trying to build community in an institution that isn't made for it. So the round dance revolution of Idle No More had traversed Canada, the US, and the world. We wanted to do this as a closing moment for Rebecca Belmore's exhibition at the AGO. And it was amazing because all of those folks that came, there was people driving from other cities, other provinces, just to do this round dance because they felt it was a call, a call for that kind of action where they normally wouldn't actually, many of them had never set foot in the Art Gallery of Ontario. So a way in which to bring our artists also to the communities that they want to speak to, because this was a community that she wanted to speak to and that her work speaks to, but would never see or engage the work if we hadn't done this event, because they just don't go to galleries like this. So those are just a bunch of things that, happen on a daily basis in my daily life. And we can get into the nitty gritty of what all those actual real strategies are and what kind of philosophies underline them. Because I think a lot of what we do that's exciting is actually not visible. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Wanda. Yay. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing us the many ways in which you've been centering Indigenous philosophy inside the museum. And I personally love how you spoke about allowing spectators to find their own paths through your exhibition. So there's like no fixed narrative, that kind of idea that the authoritative curatorial voice that we're so used to is just, thrown out the window. That's something I try to do as well, but I really appreciate that part of your practice.
And I should say, there's no such thing as Indigenous philosophy, right? It would be Anishinaabe, it would be Haudenosaunee, it would be very specific ones.
Right. Great. So we'll catch up on some of those things during our round table. I want to turn to our final speaker, Richard Bell. You ready, Richie?
Do it, baby, do it. You're muted.
I'm asking you to unmute now. Perfect.
Ah, okay, cool. Yeah, well, I'd like to, acknowledge all the people that Megan acknowledged there before. I'm not very good at that. I'm too busy trying to think of what I'm going to say next. So I'd like to acknowledge the people there in Arizona, and all the other people. All the three speakers before me were fantastic. I'm so happy to be involved in this, and thanks, Maura, for inviting me. I'm not really a curator. I'm an artist, but I do a project that is a memory of an event that was very important in Aboriginal Australia, but it also had ramifications for the nation. It was the occasion of the establishment of an Aboriginal tent embassy in the national capital of Australia, Canberra. Well, they had this great idea to go down to Canberra and set up an Aboriginal tent embassy, which is in itself, an assertion of sovereignty and the idea that there were more than one nation here, and that Aboriginal people made up some of those nations. Well, when they got to Canberra, the four young gentlemen who went down there to establish and they didn't have a tent though. So they went around and asked all the Aboriginal people in Canberra if they had a tent. Nobody had a tent. So I went around asking the white people who was working with the black people if they had a tent, and nobody had one. And but one of them had a beach umbrella, so that became the first Aboriginal tent embassy. So and it was it made a huge impact. It was a response, a direct response to a statement by the Prime Minister of the country, where he said that he would never give Aboriginal people land rights in this country, but him and his government and his party would never do that. And so the response was to send these four guys down to Canberra, establish a tent embassy, and then at a later date, they were to arrange a big mass meeting of people from all over Australia. And that happened later in the year. And just some pictures, next picture, please. And there's different iterations. The beauty of a tent embassy, as a place of protest is fantastic, because it's not only collapsible. If they take it away, you can just get another one. And it's just these pop-up embassies. And the story, when they went to camp there, after they established a tent embassy there, the police came, of course, and the chief of the police there, he informed them that if they had more than 11 tents there, that his officers would be forced to take all the tents away. So of course we just had 11 tents, so and kept it at that number until later. It became such an embarrassment for the Australian government that they sent in the police to take it down, to tear it down. And of course that went around the world. Images of police violently tearing down tents and fighting with Aboriginal people went around the world. It was televised in more than 80 countries that night, and that made some kind of impact back here. And the people here realised that they actually lived in a world that was inhabited by many other people, and they didn't all think in the same way. And there was an outcry, and that gave great heart to the Aboriginal people. That we had that capacity to get there, and which brings me to how I became politicized. I went down to Sydney. I met the people who were involved in that action, and I became politicized there. I was growing up on Aboriginal reserves and in Aboriginal communities, and I wasn't from a political family, so I got to Redfern in Sydney and met all these people who were involved in the Black Power movement, and who actually established this tent embassy and that sort of thing. One of the guys who set it up was one of my cousins. Another guy, comes from a town across the border from me, where he's related to one half of the town, and I'm related to the other half. So, and that was a guy called Michael Anderson. He is the sole surviving member of that Aboriginal tent embassy project. And he started discussions online in about 2010, 2011 about sovereignty. We'd never been able to get sovereignty on the table. And he inspired the young people here to set up, Aboriginal tent embassies all around the country, in country towns as well as the cities. So, and I thought, wow, this is phenomenal. I decided to do a tent embassy project where I would pay homage to not only the people who established the original tent embassy, but to the young people who were establishing them all around the country. And those kids actually got sovereignty on the table. We'd been trying for decades to do so, and it failed. And these youngsters actually got it. And this is an image of my first tent embassy, which was also a beach umbrella. And that was held in Melbourne. Well, there was a couple of banana chairs there. There's an esky there, beers. So I was sitting back, with Gary Foley, who was one of our most famous Aboriginal activists here, and we were sitting around having a discussion about the good old days. And well, we had a couple of beers, to make it go down easier. So, and I think the next place I had it was, can we have the next slide? Yeah, the next place was here. This is the Menage, in Moscow, just across from the Kremlin. That was the first time I had a tent as an embassy, and it was up on elevated above all the other artworks in that Biennale. Alan Michelson, from New York City, Indigenous artist from the US. He was one of my guests there, and he's been a guest in about 4 of the embassies, including in New York City when I went there, where we had was it Black Lives Matter? The people who started Black Lives Matter were there. Sylvia McAdam, who started once Idle No More and the tiny houses thing. Emery Douglas, who was the minister for culture in the Black Panther Party. The embassy, I curate that, I suppose. Yeah, well, I do. I curate these embassy shows. I do them, and they're based on collective, approaches to things. I think I've gone up over time a little bit. Jesus Christ!
Yeah, you have about 2 more minutes, so I'd love it if you could talk about sort of like who you invite and how you kind of curate the programming. That's really important, Richie. Thanks.
Okay, well, wherever I go, I try to get local Indigenous people and to talk about whatever issues that they want to talk about. Like in Palestine, I had Jemana Mana. I had this old guy who's Bedouin, who he was 7 years old during the Nakba, and he came on there and spoke. That was amazing. I've had like Emery Douglas. In Venice last year, I had members of the Sami Parliament. They spoke as well as Sylvia McAdam, Alan Michelson, once again, Franca Tamasari, who's a local Italian woman who's a friend of mine. She provided the Venetian team that I needed to be able to deliver an embassy project in Venice. It was in Arnhem, in the Netherlands. Who else is there? Yeah, basically I try to, with the embassy, I try to spend as much money on my guests as I can. In art, artists get just 5% of the budget. So I try to my hardest to get as much money as possible, but it's almost impossible because the money goes to airline companies and motel companies and these sorts of things. So anyway, I think I'm running out of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richie. Thank you. Thanks for sharing all about that. I look forward to, kind of teasing out some of these ideas when we get to the roundtable, which we are about to enter into. I've asked the speakers to come with a question ready in hand, and I'll turn to Paul because I think he has a very wonderful opener, I think, sort of question. So if we could just have the roundtable people turn on their mics or turn off their mutes, we'll be good to go. So I'll turn to you, Paul. Thanks.
Well, I find myself being really thirsty because it's such a bummer that the panel's not going to be able to hang out tonight together.
I know.
Times in New York and Venice, and who can even remember? So it's just fantastic to see you guys again. So let me see. My question was, it's probably many of you tuning in have heard it, but it was a question James Luna posed after there was this huge burst, for us anyway, in funding and attention in 1992 because of the Columbus Quincentenary. So James Luna, being smarter than most of us, he basically did artwork and put out a statement that said, "Call me in '93." He said, "I don't trust you guys to be serious about this. You'll find some money to do something about Indigenous stuff now, but it probably won't sustain." And so when I think about when those of us on the panel were hanging out, it was still, it feels like a different era, because in the US there were just a handful of institutions that would show Native art regularly. And that's changed a lot. And there are a lot of institutions that would not show Native art that now do. And so the question was, how do others on the panel think about these last couple of years when it seems pretty remarkable, but should we be suspicious of it? Have we really turned a corner? I'm not sure myself. So that's my question. How do we assess this moment?
Okay. I don't think it's changed that much. I think spaces are a little more open and there's an attempt to do things, but I think, well, in this country anyway, I'm in a country where there's 2 contemporary Maori art curators, and one has recently resigned a position from Auckland Art Gallery because it became an untenable kind of situation for that person. Now that continues to occur on a like a daily basis, and I think there's a want, but I'm not sure we're there yet. That's my opinion. And sometimes I look back at stuff that happened before, which is much more radical and much more kind of progressive than the moment that we're in at the moment, currently. I think there's a bit of window dressing that goes on. I don't know. I don't know if it's progressed that much from my perspective.
What do you think, Wanda? Richard?
I would say that I agree, but that I act as if everything has changed. So everything I do is as if it is a completely different world, and I don't give a fuck, what what all the depressing shit is. I'm just like, just gotta keep, you know, it's like acting, like I act as if sovereignty exists, not as if I'm fighting for it. It's like a different mindset. So I can't get mired down in feeling like nothing's changed, because it actually prevents me from moving, from doing anything. Like I get so depressed that it's like untenable for me to act.
Right.
So that's probably why I don't work from a place of critique either, because I just don't have the personality for it. Like I can't be in that. I have to create things, because I just go, yeah, I'll just like jump off a bridge basically and say, fuck it. So I have to keep myself alive. But I will say that I will say, like, we have, you know, we have all these like markers, like centenaries, like we had one in Canada as well. I chose not to do anything that related to it. So I did lots of things, but I just made sure it wasn't attached to that. So I make tiny choices for myself about how I'm going to engage that. And then as far as the international scene goes, like the desire for us is very similar. I still feel like we're in a human zoo. I still feel like we are desired for our authentic kind of past and not really what we're doing right now. But, you know, Richard's going to the Tate, so, you know, we'll be fine.
Richard will be fine.
Right.
He's like busting heads, breaking hearts, you know, all around the globe.
Well, I mean, it's acting as if things have changed, but you just made a really good point, which is Richard is going to the Turbine Hall, you know, but in the likes of, you know, Kara Walker and Tanya Bruguera, it's, you know, it's extraordinary. Richard, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
Yeah, look,
Slightly joking.
I think things have changed so much, you know. Well, from when I started, no Aboriginal person had ever shown, you know, in a show at the Queensland Art Gallery, you know, our state institution. Now there's been dozens. They still don't do a good job, you know, like, but I expect them to do a great job, you know, fuck it. You know, I have expectations, you know, like, you know, but when we look at, if we want to get negative, if we look at things as they really are, Aboriginal art in this country is, you know, between 5 and 10 times bigger than the entirety of the rest of Australian art. So, you know, we should have the biggest spaces, you know, like we have an arrangement in our museums here that when the tourists come to our country and go to the museums, you know, the first thing, well, the only thing they want to see basically is the Aboriginal art, because they've seen, you know, better examples of the European art, you know, in Europe and other places in the world. So what happens is that the Aboriginal art gets hidden way down the back, you know, so the tourists are forced to you know, navigate their way down to Darky's Corner, you know, right out the back, you know. So nothing much has changed in that regard. But, you know, like internationally, I think Aboriginal art is going to be pushed and elevated. Indigenous arts from around the world, we're going to experience what the Islamic artists are experiencing right now, and what African artists experienced before that. So yeah. I just got to live long enough to cash in on this shit, you know. So. And Wanda, you know, seeing you got so much budget there, you're like, installations, you know, other stuff too.
Yeah, we've got some plans, baby. We've got some plans.
Ooh, yes.
But the two of you, Wanda, Richard, you're working on a project?
No, we'll just like do something in the future.
Yeah.
Well, I bring him to Toronto though, and I'll bring him again this year. I just haven't told him yet. No, but you're right, Richard, in that sense. Like, I mean, that's why I started Abaquad, right? To bring us all together and for that kind of international community of artists and curators to grow and grow and grow, because we need to decide for ourselves who we're putting forward, right? And what we want to do and how we want to be talked about, not let them cherry pick us off and fight with each other for the smallest scraps, right?
No, we've got to take it over. But, I never went to art college or anything like that. You know, so, my art education was, you know, inviting, you know, like people who I thought knew about art and bring them around to my place, you know, cook a meal for them, you know, like, you know, give them alcohol, drugs, and I pumped them for information about art. You know, so I'd like to do a lot more of that. You know, I've found that I actually don't know that much about art still. So.
Yeah, Richie, for those that don't know, Richie's self-taught artist. What about, y'all have other questions for each other?
Yeah. I got a question.
Yeah.
Why is visual art, as opposed to literature, so important to you as an Indigenous person?
Say that again, Richard, sorry.
Well, why is visual art, you know, so important to you? You know, like, my fucking alarm. Man. Oh, sorry. Yeah, like
We're supposed to be waking up now.
Why is it so important in comparison to other art forms? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
I think artists are some of the smartest people I know, I think, and I often think it can change the way that you see the world. You know, like there's this power in art that, you know, can shift and transform something. I think working to and for artists, the way in which artists operate and the way that they see the world is quite different than any other person. And for me, I suppose it's an exciting kind of proposition. I don't know what it is to work with a writer in the same way, or but maybe it's just, I mean, it's not just painting and sculpture. To me, it's, you know, it's that creative thought or the way in which that operates. So for me, I suppose art kind of saved me in many ways. I don't know what I would be if I didn't work with art. You know, what would I have to say? Or, you know, I think it's kind of, it becomes part of your being. And I suppose it's the most exciting and kind of revolutionary thing you could kind of be engaged with, maybe, because you can say things, it's a great leveler. You can say things through art practice that perhaps you cannot say in any other way. And it's, you know, it can carry a whole lot of things if it wishes to, or it simply can just kind of be. So I suppose I'm interested in art, I don't know, for all sorts of reasons, but I suppose I'm a convert. I believe in it and its power.
Me too.
I think of the, like, maybe old school, like, but I mean, there's so many art forms that traverse all those boundaries, and I love all that. And I work in all the different art forms, not just visual, but visual is its own language. Like, there are things you can do in the visual arts you can't do in any other field. Like, it's why it exists, you know, and that it can communicate something different than every other field, you know. Like, a painting can't be a novel, and if you make it a novel, it'll suck. And vice versa, you know. It's like some people who become really hardcore researchers, they forget that they're artists, and then like their shows end up having everything in the kitchen sink, you know. It's like, we call that everything in the kitchen sink, but you know, it's like to keep pure in a sense, to be really, really white about it. I think that the visual is a form that has its own way of communicating over every other other forms, if it's good. Yeah, and artists see the future, but I think that's true of other art forms too.
I agree.
I want to just switch it up here for a second. I'm thinking as we've all been talking
Paul
about.
hasn't answered this question though.
What was that?
Paul hasn't answered this question.
Oh, Paul. I'm sorry, Paul. Did you want to answer that question?
What Wanda said.
Okay. So anyway, I'm kind of curious, because obviously there are many ways that we've been discussing kind of centering indigeneity in the museum. I think exhibition programming obviously is what most of us are interested in, but obviously reconfiguring permanent collections, exploring new narratives, commissioning museological interventions. We haven't addressed it, but ethically addressing repatriation claims would be another move that museums need to make. But I'm interested in what's happening internally, right? It's like, are these ideas embedded in like strategic plans? It's sort of like, is structurally what's happening, right? Because we can do all of these amazing projects, but they're temporary in a way. What's happening structurally that can really transform things in your specific museums? I don't know if I'm making that clear, but does that make sense?
Yeah.
Papa is a bicultural institution by statute. So it's not a treaty-led institution, which maybe it should be, but it's a bicultural institution by statute, meaning that, biculturalism came out of the 1990s, and it is a postmodern kind of construct that really addresses the Treaty of Waitangi as the foundational document of the country, and the partnership kind of honours the partnership between Māori, iwi Māori, and those here by the right of the treaty. There's still some confusion around that though, I think, but it is embedded in that institution, which I think is a really positive thing. And then they have a number of policies which are extremely helpful. One of them is related to what they call the Manatanga Policy, which is about respecting the rights of the origin community and of the collections that they hold. And that goes right down to me, in my view, to individual artists and how their work is positioned, both within the collection and within the organisation and within the exhibition. So people have some autonomy, which I think is a really important. So they also hold collections, of course, because it is, it's kind of like a Smithsonian. It also has collections from the old Dominion or National Museum. So you've got, we've got Indigenous Australian collections, which are now a closed collection, but we do hold those things. There's efforts to repatriate material. We have, it's in what's called the Foreign Ethnology, or now it's called the International History Collection. So museums change their terminologies, but I think if there's some base things, they are extremely helpful. At the Government Brewster Art Gallery, they don't have any of that, I don't think. And for me, it's interesting. It's a much more contemporary space. And I think, I was invited in to work there, and there's an assistant curator who's actually a relation of mine, Hana Hiva Rose, and I had a Toi Māori intern, but that's the most Māori staff I think they've ever had in that gallery ever, 3 women. And one was only for 3 months. There's a whole lot of work to do in terms of an engagement with the local community and those iwi communities who never go there, who never go there. When I was welcomed in there and had my mihi, an auntie of mine, it was the first time, she's in her 60s, lives in Waitara, which is the Māori community out that way. She said, well, it's the first time I've been in here, because there's nothing there for them. So that spoke volumes to me, that there's no engagement with those communities. So that institution, although there's all these really progressive things around contemporary art, still has a lot of work to do.
Yeah, well, basically museums and art galleries are trophy rooms for the rich.
Yeah. We don't want them to.
But Megan, you raised an interesting issue, which is precisely kind of what I think I was getting at, which is staffing, right? I mean, and just basic structural like management styles that are about not sharing authority, but are these top-down corporatized management styles, right? Like that's also working against the work that we're trying to do, right? And, you know, kind of like rewriting acquisition policies or, you know, just deaccession policies to address inequities. Like, I think it's like, I'm seeing a lot of institutions that are talking the talk, but not walking the walk, right? So that's kind of what I'm getting at. I don't know, Wanda and Paul, if, like how it works within your institutions, but structurally, are you seeing shifts as well in a positive direction?
As a, yeah, I think as Wolf Clan, I'm always thinking strategies. And I think from looking at what other people have done, my feeling is like, you've got to come from the ground up, you got to slice across the middle, and you got to come from the top down all at once. Otherwise, you choose one route and you get fucked in another way. Yeah. So I'd rather be really, really ambidextrous and just like all flexible and stuff.
I quote you on that.
Anyway, but what Richard said is true. So I think that that was the first barrier that we had to reinstalling the permanent collection was one, nobody knows who these artists are. Two, their artwork isn't worth as much as the artwork we were taking down. And three, you know, the collectors will be mad. And so, and the donors will be mad, right? So I think that these are very, very real things, you know, but we did an offensive move. Like we went and talked face to face with all of the donors, with all of the collectors, invited them in for their own personal kind of conversations. And actually, which is my kind of optimism bullshit that I have, is that I approach people as if they aren't going to disappoint me or hurt me, or, you know what I mean? And so I find that people sometimes will rise to the occasion. And I did find that these people that I would assume wouldn't care and would be really upset, actually were super supportive. And then we're like, oh my God, most of the Indigenous work on the walls, we don't even own yet. Like, here's some money, buy it. Wow. And so this kind of stuff started happening. And so all because they were approached, I think, from the point of view of not assuming what they believe or think or want, and just trying to figure it out, or at least create their desire for it. Yeah. So I think that was, and I can't say that everybody, it's not 100% of them had changed their mind. There's still some sticklers, but many of them are shifting and changing. Even our committee, they've started buying contemporary Indigenous art. These are people who bought old school historical Canadian painting only, you know what I mean? And they're now buying like Richard Bell's work, or like, you know, this kind of stuff that they didn't even understand as art before. So things like that. But then we're also going through policy changes. We're working on like a larger kind of statement thing, and then those policies will infect the entire building. We have a power sharing model in our department. We don't, it's equal. So we don't have a top-down model. There's a whole bunch of things. I could go on and on about all the kind of repercussions down to contracts of the fact that we, you know, don't own the products of Indigenous labor. Yeah.
I'm so heartened to hear that, and kudos to you for that strategy of optimism. That's really.
But it's not perfect, believe me. There's so much work to be done.
Yeah, but it's also a sign of, I think, a little bit of how things are shifting. Paul, what's going on structurally, internally at Smithsonian? Similar things?
Well, definitely there's more interest in collecting by some of our sister museums on the mall in terms of Indigenous art. We only buy and collect Native art. So for us, the structural thing's more about saying, okay, if we have a renewed commitment to social justice, what does that mean for the Smithsonian? What does it mean for NMAI? And I think there's a parallel with, you know, Fortune 500 companies and professional sports leagues become woke and are all about social justice. There was a great quote from a NFL executive that said, well, we don't think social justice is political. So I thought that was perfect explanation of, you know, what a lot of big enterprises.
It's a bit of a head spinner.
Yeah, it's just, we're all for that. So, you know, Smithsonian is very hard to move. But there's a lot of talk about it. I think we have to see what form it actually takes.
But there is also, I guess, in the non-happy way, an increasing kind of clamp down, I find, on our freedom of speech as human beings who have action and activity in the world outside of our positions. So I've been feeling that kind of heaviness in the world and in my own job. So
Yeah, I'm sure.
do you want to hear my question?
Yay, yes.
Yes, please.
It'll piss you off.
Oh.
I'm
It'll
so
piss you off.
excited.
Yeah. Who will it
But
piss?
I've been thinking a lot about like what does freedom mean, like in the Anishinaabe context, like looking at the words like in our language, looking at what it means and thinking about, because I want to know, because I think this is something I'm fighting for in a sense, right? Like as a human being for many, many of us and for my community, for my kids, for everybody. But then I'm like, what the fuck does that mean? You know, what does it mean? And what does it look like? And again, in Anishinaabe, everything always is process orientated. So freedom, again, is not a place, it's a process, but it's a way of being in the world. And it usually centers around like what being a good being is, you know? So anyway, just wondering what you guys think about freedom.
Why would that piss us off?
Because it's one of those like late at night truth or dare kind of questions. It's best done over drinking.
Like
Richard?
censorship, like Aboriginal people self-censor, you know, like every day. Like, and there's this belief among white people that, you know, like art should be uncensored and all these things, you know, that their lives shouldn't be censored. Bullshit. You know, like, we have to be considerate of other people, of our members of our community, you know, like not just our families and friends. You know, like, we have to consider all these things. So that impacts on that kind of freedom. I'm sort of questioning that as well. You know, like I'm seeing, you know, like the freedom to, you know, carry a gun in the United States. You know, like, freedom of freedom, all this sort of stuff. You know, like, and yet it's a fraught thing. Like I'm very interested in the question too. Anybody got answers?
No, I don't necessarily have an answer for freedom. I think it is something that you aspire to, obviously, and that idea of, I suppose, maintaining your own integrity is part of it for me, I suppose, regardless of what circumstance you are in, that you have an integrity that's inherent, that you kind of maintain, and that gives you that sense perhaps of freedom, you know, like in terms of that, so people can't kind of erode that or tell you how to be or shut you down or, you know, censor your conversations really, because, you know, you have an autonomy. And I suppose I maintain that even, you know, it could be the worst room in the world with a whole lot of people who are like devils, you know, in the room. I'm like, I know that they're all kind of gunning or stabbing me as I'm sitting there, but you know, I know that I have an integrity that is, you know, that I can't really quantify, but, you know, my intent and the way in which I operate in the world is important. It's not just the act of, it's what I'm intending from that. You know, I don't wish to cause harm or to anyone, or, you know, I am trying to shift ground. I'm really happy to kind of open space. I'm also really happy to stand there while people throw things at me, you know, because I think it's kind of important to take a position and to have a position, but also, as I said, maintain a kind of sense of integrity, which means for me, I suppose that's the way I interpret. It's not fixed, of course, freedom, I suppose, at this moment, intellectual freedom, like, you know, they can colonize all sorts of things, but they can't colonize my brain, not necessarily. They may think they are.
Maybe the Maori and the niche are more alike than we thought. That's such a niche way of thinking about it.
So I want to turn to the audience. You have a lot of great questions. Malvika, will people be able to ask the questions themselves, or should I read them? Would you like to?
Oh, we can just do it as we always do. I'll moderate the Q&A and I'll invite the audience members to turn on their microphones one by one.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. We've all been really enjoying this conversation in the back end. We're raving. I'm really enjoying this kind of late night truth or dare question format for our program. So stay tuned. Our first question actually is coming from Marina, and I will read her question on her behalf because she's walking around in the woods. But she says, thank you and greetings from Narragansett territory. I wonder how, as curators, you can prevent the creation of a new kind of canon that focuses exclusively on a few First Nation or Maori artists at the expense of all others. How can you showcase excellence in Indigenous art without imposing further hierarchies? So question. A question about essentializing.
Yeah, that's a good one. A new canon.
Well, again, I'm not sure there is a canon. I think, as I said, I am trying to actively build an art history and trying to chart who did what when and the significance of that. And I suppose you want to keep expanding that idea. You know, even the project that you said you were interested in, Maura, about the women of Māori modernism. I've been doing this project on Māori modernism probably only over the last 8 or 9 years. And the women, of course, do not feature at all. Most people don't even know what their names are. And there were women that were operating as artists from the 1930s. One of our first filmmakers was a Māori woman, Rāmai Hayward. You know, there were women, as I said, it's rewriting a history and it's trying to open that space yet again. The first person, Māori artist to graduate from Elam School of Fine Arts was actually a woman called Pauline Yeabury in 1942, whereas they always said, or 1946, where they always said it was someone else, Selwyn Wilson in 1952. So for me, it's kind of an interesting thing. And I suppose it's about completely expanding, continuing to expand and not kind of not rest, I suppose, and think that you have it kind of sorted. You know, it's evolving. I had yesterday someone talk to me about how they want to, you know, work with Māori modernism, but they only wanted to use, you know, through this objects because that's not to do with me. And I said, well, actually, that's because, you know, one of the artists was a ceramicist, and I said, well, actually, architecture, ceramics, the whole lot is kind of what I'm working with, not just painting and sculpture. So I suppose I don't want to create a new canon, but I do want to also kind of tell the truth about some things. Paul was talking about that earlier, you know, the truth of, you know, as I said, because history likes to write itself in a particular way, and even Māori history likes to write itself in a particular way, and the women were shut out or, you know, and completely left. So I think if I can kind of add or contribute something to, you know, broaden or expand those things.
Yeah, and the Maori women are doubly colonized.
Absolutely.
As women and as Maori individuals. So it's a double whammy. The canon, I mean, it's interesting. It's something I think about always as a curator of feminist art and looking at women's artistic production and not wanting to be ghettoized. You know, the kind of sort of separatist spaces, right? I mean, the problematics of that, but yet they're oh so necessary because we need to have, it's all about visibility, right? Yeah. We have to have visibility of artists that have been left out of the traditional conversations. Otherwise, they're not then seen, they're not visible, right? So it's a really much larger question. I don't know, Paul and Wanda, Richard, you know, kind of the canon. I mean, Paul, you're definitely in the position that you're in, Smithsonian, right? It's like, are you building a canon? And how would you describe that?
Generally, we've just been following where our little crowd of Native art folks what they've been doing in the US and Canada in the last several decades. But I think that role is changing because once you're interested, it's not that hard to find out about our artists and research them. And in fact, that's what we always wanted, other institutions that just treat us like a new Chinese artist on the scene. How do you think about that? So, we were kind of not the only game in town, but, important in that. And so success means, in a way, we're less important than we used to be. And so we're not in a position to produce huge amounts of art history. We're more collaborating with others, encouraging others. But I think it's kind of good for my museum to not see itself in leadership in the same way. I think that opens up for some more possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. Malvika, I know you have many questions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I thought that Megan Sure had a great question there. Thanks.
Can I respond to that?
Oh,
Sorry.
Yes.
Go,
Oh, of course.
yeah, please go ahead. And then, yeah.
Of course.
Okay. Well, the canon, is a Western canon.
Yeah.
It's like I'll give an example, like in the Dark Ages. History. Called the Dark Ages. The rest of the world was fine. Europe had about 10% of the world's population, so it wasn't really the Dark Ages. And to think that art can only come from one area of the world, is ridiculous, ludicrous. So I'm interested in a new canon, all right, yeah, but one that goes back beyond the starting point that we've been given. Let's get real. If you want to have a discussion about art, global art. If aliens dropped into the planet tomorrow, and they started looking for art, I'm sure they wouldn't be going to many of the museums.
That's true.
Thank you so much for that. So our next question will come from Hannah Moore. Hannah, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
All right, I think I'm here. First, just wanted to say thank you to everyone. It's been so wonderful to hear from you all. And as a student in art history, I've been thinking a lot about how to apply these ideas to looking at artists, like what Wanda referred to as artists once known, who aren't acknowledged as much as they should be now. And so I wanted to ask you all how you approach compiling and giving space to historical Indigenous art in regions that have limited information or don't have a lot of access to art institutions, people in rural areas, that sort of thing.
like specifically about the artwork itself?
Yes, because in my own experience, I live in a very rural area of Appalachia where there aren't a lot of, there isn't a canon. And so I think that does give us a little bit of an advantage because we're not working against just white supremacist art history. We are given an opportunity to start from the ground up. And so I was just curious how you acknowledge and honor those unknown artists and find information on cultural histories.
Just because I've done some shows that precisely needed this kind of research. I think from my perspective, I always start with relations. So it's like, it's a lot of talking. It's a lot of talking to people. It's a lot of like calling people on the phone and saying, you know, asking questions and then going to meet so-and-so again, and they'll send you somewhere. And then, you know what I mean? It's going down that kind of what we call the moccasin telegraph of research that will lead you to a lot of information that you couldn't get in a book and you can't get anywhere because, you know, it's just not written about. Mm-hmm. But also it's a good way to actually know what it is you're talking about because it's grounded in reality. You know, it's not made up. stuff. But yeah, I think that's the biggest part is I think art history is so divorced from human beings, from the way that people actually operate, which is in relation to each other. And so a lot of that kind of research isn't done unless you're just interviewing an artist that is, that that kind of stuff is done. But real hardcore community oral history research is not really a really big part of the art historical process yet. That's all. I don't know.
The thing with art history too, like if I'm, say, building a modern and contemporary Māori and Indigenous art history, it's a history that fits inside and also outside and doesn't fit within the mainstream because it's so much larger, to be quite honest. It's much larger. It has a longer history, trajectory, like it comes from somewhere else, and it sits inside and outside of those cultural histories. So I suppose the things that are unnamed or, we don't have the name, I mean, I kind of value those still, absolutely, because, and I like to sometimes put those things on display because someone may recognize them. It's like Wanda was talking about, someone may recognize them or may know more about them than I do. And I like to be honest about that. This is a this, but we actually don't know anything else about it. I like to be very transparent about that because I don't have the answers, and gone are the days where the curators know everything about everything, and I think the other thing I like to do is to work with people, so if it's not of or from where, or knowledge that I have, I absolutely work in with somebody else, who may have a different level of cultural knowledge than I have, and ensure that knowledge sits, flat on the floor, and so therefore those artworks or taongas also sit flat on the floor. And I said it might be I don't kind of prioritize my kind of understanding over top of theirs. In fact, they make, it's a very rich territory, as you know. So I think, I don't know the answer, but I think what Wanda's saying in terms of those conversations, I mean, there's all sorts of ways to research and to find information, and sometimes you simply can't. It doesn't mean you can't utilize it as far as I'm concerned. I think you just have to be as transparent as you can be and say, we don't know the history, like once known is a great kind of turn of phrase to say, because of course those people were once known. Of course it wasn't recorded when it was kind of captured and put in an institution. But sometimes communities can have a conversation about those things. Yeah, so that's, I don't know if that answered what you asked.
I love that response. In the interest of time, I wonder if maybe we can move on to our next question, which will come from Megan Sheard. Megan, you can turn on your microphone now.
Hi, my name is Megan. I am originally from Western Australia, currently in Southern California by some accident of life choices. And I have a question for, I guess, picking up on some of the issues of spatiality raised by both Richard and Wanda, and thinking about this idea of, so Wanda, you're talking about the way the rooms are organized, and Richard, you also mentioned that, and I'm also struck by the kind of mobile spatiality of the Tent Embassy project as well, but it's actually taking this historical and politically potent symbol and moving it into other city spaces where Indigenous presence is sometimes presumed to have been removed. So I'm just really interested in that and these issues around the opposite of what you were talking about with Aboriginal art being at the back of the gallery because they know it's going to draw the crowd. But something that I've observed a lot of is this idea of where you actually encounter, particularly with pre-colonial, colonial objects, you encounter Aboriginal art at the beginning of the museum, particularly museums, maybe not necessarily art museums, but in this way where it's integrated into a kind of pre-history of the nation, almost like that, that the Aboriginal past sort of stands in for this early phase. And also in certain cases still integrated with natural history, like in TMAG in Tasmania, it seems a little that way. And I was just wondering if any of you could speak to that issue and like how to address it. In Australia recently, the Prime Minister, in responding to some feedback on his comments about Australia Day, really referenced this idea of like, oh, but you know, Aboriginal Australia is part of all of our history. It's a part of all of our heritage. So it's something that's kind of present in the discourse, and but also in the structures in which these objects are appearing. And I notice sometimes they kind of they might be being curated better. They might be larger. They might be taking up more space, and yet they can still be fit into this kind of idea of a prehistory, if you like. So it was kind of a long-winded question.
That's what I have to say to prehistory. And then we'll move on. But I think that we can get out of chronology, period. It would be a way of getting out of colonial thinking, where, you know, pre-contact, contact, we always like, this is the kind of narrative line, and it really doesn't interest me, nor does it interest most Indigenous folks that I know. It really just shores up a national identity for a colonial nation, and not interested in it. So I think that if we think about time, time is not linear, right? It's like that was imposed. And so there's so many different ways we can think about art when we get out of chronology, and art history too. Yeah, so I think that's one thing. It's also your starting point defines where you go. So if you start from the positionality of assuming already that the history that is written is correct, then you're going to end up an asshole in the end, right? So you have to have a different starting point.
Totally.
So I always like, whatever is on the margins, just bring it to the center and you'll bring us to a better place.
Agreed.
I agree with the thing about time. There's a, you know, time is not linear in any Indigenous knowledge, or, you know, that as I understand it, in Māori, we have this thing where we talk about ki mua ki muri, where you stand in the present with the past in front of you and the future yet to arrive, you know, so you're standing backwards, basically, you know, the future arrives, keeps arriving. You're in the present moment, but you're looking at your past because you already know that it's already happened. The future's kind of yet to arrive, and it keeps arriving. So that idea of time for us is backwards. It doesn't start at this end and go to this end, and it's cyclic much more than it is. So I think that idea of shifting time is really important, and, you know, creating those ruptures. I like to create ruptures within things as well on purpose, so that ruptures something that's kind of linear and exists. So you could create a rupture in the middle of it. So I don't know, again, if I answer your question, but I liked what Wanda said about time.
Yeah, I just want to add to that, you know, it's interesting. I like what you said, Wanda, about how the linear notion of time is superimposed on it. It's like a Eurocentric concept, right? Because the way that Megan just described Maori sense of time, and I like to think about it in the exhibitions that I curate, time as being sort of wide but not long, so that it has the potentiality to be sort of kaleidoscopic and not this kind of linear progression of ideas, right? So, and it's kind of like what you were saying, like coming at things from like all these different perspectives, right? Is so much more fascinating. Is that where you were going? Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, like, not to create an us and them situation, because the West has made amazing thinkers on time. Like, read Nietzsche, I'm sorry, he's a Nazi, but Heidegger, read, like, you know, and read, you know, Merleau-Ponty. It's like, there is so much understanding about the relationship of time and bodies and histories, also within the West, that is not popularized, right? really what we're talking about is capitalism's time, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
And I also think spatially how things operate. You put, as a curator, you put things in places and to activate a space in a particular way. It's very intentional, it's very purposeful. You're not necessarily, I still want people to experience things in their own way. And sometimes it's, for me anyway, as a curator, it's an intuitive thing. There's something that will kind of shift something. You can't put that and squash that in the corner. The space around it is as important sometimes as the work, to give it time to kind of operate and breathe. And those kind of intangible ideas, I think you work with all the time, and sometimes kind of intuitively.
These are such beautiful and expansive responses. Thank you so much. They're also quite like generous. So for our final question, we'll go to our very own publisher and the captain of this ship, Fong H. Bowie. And Fong, you should be able to turn on your microphone now.
Thank you, Malvika. Thank you, Wanda. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Maura. Also, thank you, who else here?
Paul and Megan.
Oh, Megan, thank you so much. I mean, I think I've been spinning my head here of all fronts, and I just realized that I now remember a wonderful remark made by Flamek, the French painter, while he was having dinner with Matisse, and he say, intelligence is international, stupidity is national, and art local. You know, so it's terrific in that front. And then I think that in regard to the whole notion of being curator, you know, it's so wonderful that we should remember that the word itself is from curio, the Latin word, which is to care for.
Absolutely.
You remember during the Roman time when curator, it meant caretaker, given official in charge of various departments of public works like sanitation, like policing.
Sometimes we feel like we're in charge of sanitation.
But it's also mean to take care of the soul of the artist. You can't really do any much without the artist, right? So the artist, the reason why we admire the artist, unlike politicians who may advocate and try to propagate their own political agenda, if they fail to their constituent, you know they're not going to do it again. And the same applies for businessmen. Invest in this company. I will make you rich. And if he fails, he or she or they fail, you know likely they will not do it again. But the failure in the artist, the poet, the writer, the philosopher, the greater they fail, the more profound they become.
Absolutely.
You know, so that's one thing we know. And in regarding to freedom, the notion of freedom, and I think we have to remember there's positive liberty, freedom, being the possession of the capacity to act upon one's own will, free will, as opposed to negative liberty, which is freedom from external restraint on one action. And I want to say this too. I'm super happy that we all come together in this platform, social environment, which is the best tradition of American inspiring democracy. I go way back from Emerson, Thoreau, through John Dewey, through what we have already experienced, the nightmare by the right. They're very clever, super clever. Since the war ended in Vietnam, the Vietnam War ended in 1975. You remember how all these great public intellectuals, the progressive left thinker, they all moved to the academy. We don't have public intellectuals. We don't have this kind of public sphere or forum. because it's been kept in the academy for so long. So I'm happy that we all coming out together and share our opinion, observation, aspiration, and all of it, because I must say this, I've been doing the rail for 20 years long. It's been a nightmare to fundraise. Nightmare. The big foundation do not come and pay site visit to us. None of them do. And you know why? Because we don't have the mission statement. It's simply that. Our mission statement is we reflect the artist, I mean creative individual, arduous journey. They can't simply understand that. And I remember when I interviewed the former Obama appointee, the chairman of the National Endowment of Humanities. You can look it up, William Bro Adams. And he confessed to me that it's such a machine that they can't even afford to go to pay site visit, as opposed to Jim Melcher, one of the first NEA director who's become a friend. He used to send all kinds of people to come in, small nonprofit, to meet the people who run it, to see the environment, meet the staff, spend time there before they support it. You know, Jacques Reynaud used to work for him. Brian O'Doherty used to work for him. All kinds of people. And then in turn, Harvey Blanc, you remember? No one does that anymore. So we have to find a way to bond together and do what we do. And our greatest aspiration is the artist. The artist's freedom is our freedom. So that's all I have to say. Super inspiring. Probably won't be able to sleep tonight because I'm so excited. But I must say this, after 20 years of doing the rail Keep It Free, we now reached last year through the pandemic, over 2 million readership now. And the whole social environment is booked until the end of May. So it means that however long we've been separated together by the right, you know, they put us in the academy. Yeah, you guys are so smart, you're so weird. You can create all kinds of study, you know, African-American study, Asian study, gender study, which is terrific. It's a really amazing a safe haven for creative intellectual exploration, but it's now to bring it out of the academy. And that's what we're doing, you guys. So this is where we are. We're not gonna be so-called. Yes, we are moving forward.
Yes.
By all means. With
forward, backwards, sideways, and spinning all at once.
That's right, Maura. Just like Hannah Arendt said, let's think walk without the banister.
Mm-hmm.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Fawn.
Thank you, Wanda.
Thank you.
Paul. Thank you, Richard. Megan. Maura.
This has been incredible. Before we all jump off into the evening, we've now come to poetry hour. So at the Rail, we have always had a tradition of ending our lunches with a poem. And one of the silver linings of this pandemic, if I can say that, is that since physical distance is less of a barrier for us, we get to invite actual living poets to share their work. And today I have the pleasure and privilege of having the poet and one of my personal icons, India Lena González, here with us to read. She's a poet, educator, and artist. Yeah, give it up. She received her BA from Columbia, where she graduated with honors, and is a recent MFA grad from NYU's creative writing program. Her work is published in Poets and Writers, Pank, Pigeon Pages, Chordata, and Glass, a Journal of Poetry, among others. A 2020 National Poetry Series finalist, India is also a professionally trained dancer, choreographer, and actor. India, my love, take it away.
Thank you so much, Malvika. I'm so honored and humbled to be able to add some of my words to the mix for tonight's event. It's been so tremendous to witness this and to learn in the process. I'll just start by saying that I write all my poetry from my heart and from my spirit, so I do hope that you all receive it in the same way. This first poem, I think, is a great introduction into who I am a little bit. I find in the spaces that I am mostly in as a writer that people try to categorize me, and they would like me to put myself in a box for them, or several boxes, but very neat boxes. And I simply hate categorization. I think it's a way of trying to own something as a way of trying to claim it, and I don't want to be claimed. So for this poem, I thought I would lean into categorizing myself using historical term that I had to do lots of research to find, and then sort of trying to like spin that on its head, because at the end of the day, there's only one race, and that's the human race as far as I'm concerned. So that's where I'm at on that. So I'll start with the definition, and then I will go into the poem itself. Parda, feminine. A general term used in the Spanish colonies of the Americas that referred to the mixed bloods whose ancestry could almost never be accurately described. For our purposes here, it is being used in reference to the multiracial descendants of Africans, natives, and Europeans. Una parda, which is me. I am a perpetual pardon. I limp into the room and you say, "Foxwoman, get out." Smudge it and start again. I am naked and without clothing. I am the roasted house slave. I am the white man's leftovers. I am the white woman's hate. I am the highfalutin rape. Smudge it and start again. I get seasick now that I'm older. The colonial in me is wearing away, but I still have that candle in the eye called bloodlust. Those kleptomaniac grabbers, it must have felt good wearing all that gold. I am a broke-down ship. La Niña. Smudge it and start again. Nobody is a purebred anymore. I'm precocious mutt. I know all about the small living quarters for tender-tribed people like me, the people with too many ancestors inside of us. We have now painted our living room. We chose the color of bloodied up hide. We chose us. In the end, I screech during childbirth. My husband takes off down the hall like meaty antelope man. My skin is slick with sweat. I'm telling you it feels good to be this naked. Forgive me, you who are so fully clothed. All right, and then from there, my second poem, I spent some time in New Mexico. I'd like to spend more time there, but for my first trip, I had certain locations that I experienced moments at, and I wanted to sort of take that with me even as I left. So these locations, I called them desert rooms, and so I had like 3 desert rooms that I allocated and wanted to give my experience to. So this first one is desert room number 1, and it took place in 10,000 Waves Spa. We drove higher up, 3 feet away from night sky and stripped to our skins. In the women's communal tub, everyone was bared. Shay did leg exercises underwater. I laid out rib on wooden floor, stuck leaves to my chest. Twin plunged into cold water and tested how long she could stay in until her nerves gave out. We all ended staring up. The sky is a perennial laceration out west. In the grand bath, there were men and a waterfall. I moved my feet back and forth in the warm water. I was still a watercolor from the dislodged blueberries of morning. It was hard not to feel tender when I was constantly being tenderized. It was hard not to call all the bodies jiggling around in their skins dear. We were all a nascent litter, our eyes a haze, bones not fully baked. Before my shower, I saw a man writing messages onto little foam cups. I asked him if he was a poet. He said, "We're all sand in the end. The decomposition of your face will be a sad thing." I told him I'm getting cremated. He stopped his scribble to glance up at me. He pointed at my navel and said, "Very cute cut." He pointed at my head and said, "Ah, the globe." All right, I'll just do two more because we're heading into nighttime here, as I know. So this third one, I spent years trying to write this poem, and in undergrad, it was not happening. And then when I got to graduate school, it kind of just like all happened at once. And so, yeah, this is one of my greatest offerings, I think. So the title is, pardon the pronunciation, I'm still learning, but the title is Wanda Yaho. And it's the title of the Cherokee morning song that my mom passed down to me. So I think it roughly translates to I am a great spirit. So there's that. Wende Yaho, Part 1. I am sour meat, distressed birthmark. I utter your name, Big Mother, and fry bread does not fall on my head. I go to Pine Ridge Res and they do not applaud, no standing. Oh. I climb branches with their Lakota children, bake apple pies out of plain dirt. Bless us. They take me to their newly departed cat and do not cry, but the stench of it. Oh, Uncle Bubba, with your glass eye, their father through screen door does not look at me, please. I shake their hands and the earth will not rub off on me. I buy a bone necklace, parade around the gas station, linger at the counter begging for my name. I force tiny indents into bottles. Damn Wasichu. With many teeth, they send me back up to the top. Sour meat, distressed birthmark. Oh, Uncle Bubba, tell me about your hair, Big Mother. Lena, great-grandmother. They look at mine and say I am in mourning, relentless mourning, because my hair hasn't gotten to where it's trying to get to yet. When I look back, Lena, you're such real Cherokee. You are not here. This woman is a woman no longer. Part 2. Look at my horse-eaten sand. I'm talking open-mouthed windows and everyone damp inside. I'm talking Jason Momoa staring straight at my TV screen. Twin and I study his hands. We love his hands and all the things he can do with them. Shoot. He can shoot. Paint real good. Now that's a man. So Big Mother, guess what? Them Blanquitas was staring at us again with their pale hair and puritanical eyes, like who the hell was I? Because they were real reservation government cheese. New studies show that more white people claim Cherokee to authenticate their Americanness. Same old, same old. Big Mother, why didn't you teach Mama how to crouch down real low dance for them big thigh muscles? I know a thing or two about stuffing insulation in trailers for seasonal comfort. I know hikes where father pretends to fall off a cliff, and this never bothered us, but Big Mother, I need you to talk about your medicine man father, and please this time for the record, you understand, I'm sure, that sometimes a woman needs something, someone to hurl herself up against. And Richard Oakes, why'd you have to go and wear that goddamn oatmeal turtleneck sweater? You got me and Twin over here sweating at the very sight of you. Big Mother, Lena, I'm back now. And is it true? Is it true that you came to my mother in a dream many deaths before I set in her body? That you told her to name me India Lena? Is it because you knew I needed it? That Twin was the real revolutionary, all red face and feathers growing up her back? That she would show up at Wounded Knee, no Wasichu in sight, and start beating the shit out of herself, wanting a new massacre, where she finally makes it into the history books, all in the name of Lena? That all the while, I'd be simmering on the stove, getting burnt. All right, and that brings me to my last one. And also, I do have a twin in real life. She's a fiction writer, so shout out to her because she is very gracious to tune in tonight. So last one, it's a short one, so I think it's a good one to end on. The title is Death of the Fine Feathered, Afterworld. We, the fine feathered, dinosaurs who comet has come straight down to blast in the very long jugular, as though cosmic consciously thought, are heaping. The sky turns uterine, The rain a kind of breeding with clear ends in sight. Terracotta waters so broad, the breath is gone. Vertebrae petrified. Because I am dead, I cannot say. Because I am dead, I turn my head and see brother floating beside. Hands, a strand of black hair, a benevolence. Jaw and hips broke open. Thanks, that's all I got.
My God, look at how brilliant you are. Thank you so much, India. And thank you, Wanda. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Megan, for so many things that you said. Thank you, Paul. And of course, thank you to the incandescent Maura Reilly for everything that you do. And thank you to all of you who tuned in today in the audience and in the chat. We're celebrating the Rail's 20th anniversary with events and conversations just like this one. We're celebrating all year. It's the longest birthday party you can imagine. So if you can, please consider making a contribution to keeping the Rail and our special projects free, relevant, and independent, just like this daily conversation series. And please join us again tomorrow when we're joined by artists Shireen Nishat and Shoja Azari, who will be in conversation with the critic Charles Chafaye, and that will be, as always, not always, that will be as usually at 1 p.m. Eastern right here in the Zoom. Other than that, you can now turn on your microphones. I'll shoot you all an invitation to unmute. But thank you all so much. This has been incredible.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
And you rock it, Wanda.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you.
Richard. Thank you,
Thank you all.
Wanda. Thank you. Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
for freedom.
Wanda.
Thank you,
India, for the beautiful.
Thank you. This was great.